figure it out. All right, well, there we go. Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm Kathleen at the National Council for History Education with my colleague Shauna, and we are very pleased to welcome you tonight to our webinar series where we will be exploring the innovation journeys of African Americans with our colleagues at the Henry Ford Museum. So I'm pleased to turn it over to Olivia Marsh, who is part of the learning team at the Henry Ford, and Olivia will introduce her colleagues and the topic for tonight. So take it away, Olivia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathleen, and hello, everybody. And if you're watching this later, hello. My name is Olivia Marsh. I'm the manager of educator engagement and professional development at the Henry Ford, which is a campus in Dearborn, Michigan, right outside Detroit. And we have a museum, we have an outdoor living history area, and we have a couple of other institutions as well on our campus. And this evening, we are representing the learning and engagement team. We do a lot of work with educators like yourselves and a lot of outreach in our area and across the country. So we're thrilled to be able to present this tonight. And before we get started, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues, Phil Grum and Janice Warju, who are going to be, we're going to be tag teaming it tonight to present this information to you. So Phil, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Olivia. And thank you to the National Council for History Education. We love working with you all, and we're so excited to present this tonight. So hi, everybody. My name is Phil Grum. I'm the Senior Manager of Learning Services and On-Site Programs at the Henry Ford. I've been at the Henry Ford going on 12 years. And I'm really excited about what we're presenting tonight because our area of work covers educators, students, youth, and families. We do programming for those different audiences. We build curriculum resources and lesson plans. We do professional development programs like being at this webinar tonight. And we have a really cool job where we get to dig through our 26 million artifacts. Okay, maybe we haven't gotten through all 26 million, but dig through our artifacts and find some really interesting, cool stories. Some that maybe you've heard of, familiar faces, familiar names. But some things that maybe you haven't seen or heard of before. And we like to figure out what makes an innovator innovative, using artifacts and history to kind of study and explore that. So I'm going to be pretty behind the scenes tonight, but it's great to see meet all of you, and thank you for being here. And I'll throw it over to Janice.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Janice Warju. And I'm super, super happy to be with you tonight. I am a retired history teacher, well, social studies teacher. I taught every subject you could imagine in social studies for over 30 years. And I am a master presenter. I started at the Henry Ford back in 2004. It was my summer job. I was a Model T driver, like the absolute coolest summer job a history teacher could ever possibly have. And a few years ago, 5 years ago, a little bit more than that now, the learning and engagement team was kind enough to let me come and help with a couple of projects and then asked me if I could hang around a little bit. And so I am now the learning coordinator for content development, and I am a master presenter. And so I get the wonderful job of sharing with you some African-American inventors tonight from our collections, and one of my favorite things to do. So if I sound like I'm lecturing at you, it's those 30 years in the classroom. So sorry.
Thanks, Phil and Janice. So in a minute, Phil's going to share a screen and we'll launch into the presentation. But I just wanted to remind everybody and encourage you, if you have questions while we're going through this presentation, please put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them. If we don't have an answer now, we will do some research and get back to you. We will also be following this up with a list of resources from our collections, some blog posts and videos and things like that that support the stories we're going to show you tonight. So you can keep an eye out for that. So without further ado, we are here to explore the journeys of African-American innovators. And when you look at an institution like the Henry Ford, as Phil mentioned, we have a lot of artifacts. We have millions of artifacts and millions of stories. And one of the things we really try to do as a learning and engagement department is break that down. So how do we make that approachable and manageable for educators, in this case, to use these artifacts and primary sources in their classroom? So before we get into the stories tonight, we wanted to start off with defining what we mean by what an innovation is or what innovators do. And we define it in a pretty specific way, primarily because when you think of the word innovation, A lot of people think of technology and high-tech things like computers or coding or things like that. And while those things certainly can be innovations, we look at innovation as a bit broader. So we have everything in our collection from clocks to Model Ts to airplanes to the Rosa Parks bus, which is behind me right now. And so when we look at innovation as a whole, we think about things that address a real need, something that improves on something we already do or use, not something necessarily that's brand new. But it's also really importantly something that changes our behavior. So whether that's a physical thing, whether that's a social movement that changes how people behave, we define all of those things to be innovation. And the people who do those things, we define as innovators. So you're going to find several different examples of different kinds of innovation and innovators tonight. And to help us do that, to help us give us some foundation to do that with, we have looked at our collections and our stories and pulled out some common actions of innovation and some common habits of innovators that come up really frequently in our stories. So that regardless of whether we're talking about Henry Ford or Rosa Parks or George Washington Carver, some of the folks you'll hear about tonight, we can use the same language to talk across their stories. So we'll talk more about what that means as we go through the presentation, but essentially the actions of innovation on the left-hand side of your screen talk about uncovering a problem, defining what that problem really means, designing solutions. So these actions are not meant to be taken in a particular order. They may look similar to the engineering design process or design thinking, if you're familiar with those frameworks. But this one is fairly unique because we pair it with the habits of an innovator. So those, some people call them those soft skills or 21st century skills like challenging the rules and being empathetic, asking questions and staying curious. So we believe that we can apply these frames to our stories and to our collections and to historical people, but we can also look inwards and be a bit self-reflective and use them to apply to our own lives. So for example, I could look at the habits and say, well, I'm really good at being empathetic, but I need to work on challenging the rules. So we can look at our collections to find examples of people who challenged the rules and try to practice those things in our daily lives. So we'll talk more about this as we go through the presentation, like I said, and if you're looking for more information on this framework in particular, you'll find that in our resource list that we'll share after this. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Janice, who's going to talk you through some of our stories. You are muted, Janice.
Sorry, thanks, Olivia. And if you don't mind, I'm going to turn my screen off so I'm not looking at myself talking to you. All right, so welcome everyone. With the habits and actions of innovators in mind, we'd like to focus first on 3 African-American inventors who you may or may not be familiar with, but we think their stories can teach important lessons to students today. Elijah McCoy. We have a wonderful actor who portrays Elijah McCoy during field trip season in Greenfield Village, our outdoor venue. And incorporating that story into a lesson for 4th graders led us on a quest to find out the true story of McCoy's life. A lot of unverifiable information is often written and repeated about him, but let's focus on some of the things that I know we can prove. We know, for instance, Elijah McCoy was born in Colchester, Ontario, Canada, in either 1843 or 44, but no birth certificate was ever recorded. His parents, George and Millie, left Kentucky in the late 1830s. According to one of their daughters in an interview she gave in 1913, George had been freed by his owner. Millie was a runaway, and they escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad, which of course we can't verify, but Colchester is just a short distance from Detroit, which was a stop on the Underground, and Colchester did have a significant population of African Americans by the 1840s. George is listed as a landowner and a tobacconist in their township assessment for 1845. George, Millie, and the first 5 of their children, including Elijah number 3, are listed in the 1851 Canadian census. We also know they were landowners in Ypsilanti, Michigan in 1863, and they are not in the 1861 Canadian census. Stories say Elijah studied in Scotland, and the University of Edinburgh lists him as an alumnus, though they have no records to verify that he was there. and it's much more likely that he apprenticed in engineering than actually matriculating there. We know that he was hired by the Michigan Central Railroad, but not for his engineering expertise. He was hired as a fireman and oiler, which meant he kept the fire loaded with coal and oiled the steam engine as it traveled, requiring walking along the side of the locomotive. So if you want to go down to the Sam Hill there, you had to walk along the side of the engine while it was drifting or coasting and pour oil into the cup near the front, that brass cup at the front right there. This is a beautiful 1858 locomotive nicknamed the Sam Hill from our collection. Well, performing this incredibly dangerous task is what inspired his first invention, the automatic lubricating cup, which he patented in 1872 and continued to optimize over the following years, as this next picture, an 1882 patent would show. So this is a lubricator cup and a patent for an updated lubricator cup. Over the next 40 years, McCoy would be granted at least 52 patents and design registrations. That number varies too, according to the source, but a search of the actual patent books for his active years show 52 that we can prove were issued. He often assigned partial rights to others, probably to support his inventing and innovating. Not an uncommon practice, but particularly for African-American inventors at that time. He opened the Elijah McCoy Manufacturing Company, though it was never terribly profitable. Elijah and his second wife, Mary, however, were very well known in the Detroit area for much more than just his inventing. They opened an orphanage and a home for aged women for the African-American community here. Mary McCoy was particularly active in women's organizations and the suffrage movement. She passed away in 1923. His last patent was issued for an update of this next patent, which is a 1916 graphite lubricator. Not long after that 1926 patent was issued, though, he was out of money, and he was sent to the county poorhouse, Eloise. It was also a psychiatric hospital, infirmary, and it was the asylum for Wayne County. When he passed away in October of 1929, he was destined for one of over 7,000 burial sites, marked by nothing but numbered blocks for those who died at Eloise. Their graves have mostly been lost to overgrowth over the years, but there have been efforts recently to try and uncover them and figure out who they were. Neighbors and friends, thank goodness, collected enough money to provide a decent burial for McCoy in Detroit Memorial Park. Along with numerous improvements for lubricators, McCoy also patented a few other things. An ironing table, that little turtle there is a lawn sprinkler, a tire tread, and a rubber heel for shoes. Now we can use his story in our Model I learning framework, and we create what's known as what we call an innovation journey. Now this is a wonderful activity for students because it gives them practice in identifying the habits and actions, but it also illustrates that it's not a straight line to innovate, and students could identify different habits and actions in building their own version of a journey. We'll move on to the next. It was one thing to frequent businesses in your own neighborhood if you were an African-American in the early 20th century. But what happened when you took an out-of-town road trip? Would the place be safe to stop? African-American motorists faced the potential of physical violence, racial profiling, or being forced out of whites-only towns, sundown towns in both the North and the South. Some African-American travelers never even made it to their destinations. They just disappeared. With the possibility of such situations, African-American motorists often had to pack their own food, blankets, pillows, containers of gas, even a coffee can or a bucket to use as a toilet. They had to make prior plans to stop with relatives or friends, sometimes driving miles out of their way. That is until the Greens. Postal carrier Victor Green and his wife Alma introduced this book in 1936, empathizing with other travelers by creating the Negro Motorist Green Book, offering a directory of safe places for African-American travelers. As Victor told it, the idea for the guidebook came to him in 1932, after his own and the constant complaints he heard from friends and neighbors about difficult experiences they had when traveling by car. He designed the guide like ones created for Jewish travelers who had a long history of discrimination at vacation spots. The Greens collaborated in updating their guide every year until Victor's death in 1960, and then Alma continued on her own for several years. In it, They listed and reviewed hotels and restaurants that catered to African Americans during the time of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. The 1936 edition provided information for a limited area around New York, as Green had been a mail carrier in Hackensack, New Jersey, and later they moved to Harlem. The demand for the guide, however, was so great that by the following year, this 1937 edition, he optimized the guide, making it national, covering all US states and several international destinations. He also took distribution nationwide. Green collected the listings through his contacts in the Postal Workers Union, as well as by asking users to submit suggestions. As the book became more popular, he was able to commission agents to solicit new business listings and to verify the accuracy of the ones that they had. From his small-scale publishing house in Harlem, Green distributed the book by mail order to Black-owned businesses and at Esso service stations. Esso was a rare gasoline distributor that franchised to African Americans, was part of Standard Oil at that time. He sold copies at Black churches, the Negro Urban League, virtually anywhere that African Americans might find them. Publication of the Green Book was suspended, of course, during World War II between 1942 and 1946, but it started up again with the post-war travel boom in 1947. Yep, the next one, please, Phil. Green was really an entrepreneur looking for ways to aid African-American travelers, so he created a vacation reservation service, booking reservations at any hotel or resort listed in the book, and then he issued a supplementary directory of summer resorts that welcomed Black vacationers, called it the Green Book Vacation Guide, and it's seen in the ad here. He implemented a distribution system, putting copies wherever African Americans would likely to find them, including AAA offices, which explains how this next item, the 1949 Negro Motorist Green Book, is in the Henry Ford's AAA Michigan collection. It includes what you would expect, roadside amenities for lodgings, gas stations, and restaurants, but it also lists many local businesses that you might need. The barbershop, a beauty parlor, included liquor stores, and even some nightclubs. He's optimizing here. Probably the most difficult and risky aspects of cross-country travel was the question of where to stay overnight. The Green Book attempted to update its listings as often as possible, but safe places were often miles out of the way. The most extensive listings of hotels and motels were in northern cities, of course, with large populations of Black Americans. Places like Detroit, of course, Chicago, New York, and in the West, Los Angeles. In smaller towns, there might be a tourist home or two, which meant you stayed in a room in someone's house, but many towns didn't even have a single listing. In 1952, Victor retired from the Postal Service and became a full-time publisher. He renamed the guidebook the Negro Traveler's Green Book to reflect the increasing popularity of international travel, both by ship and airplane. By 1955, the book was endorsed and in use by AAA, the American Automobile Association, and its hundreds of affiliated clubs throughout the country. It was also used by travel bureaus, bus lines, airlines, travelers' aid societies, libraries, and of course, it had thousands of subscribers. Green charged only enough to make a modest profit. He never became rich. It really was all about helping. The market for the Green Book, though, began to erode. You can go to that last slide there, Phil. It began to erode in the late 1960s, especially after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 legally prohibited racial segregation. Increasing numbers of middle-class African Americans began to question whether the book was doing more harm than good, because they felt it encouraged Jim Crow practices. It steered Black travelers to segregated businesses instead of encouraging integration. The new interstate highway systems with integrated hotels, though, became preferable. They were more convenient than detouring to Black-owned lodgings that were often in remote locations. The Green Book, however, maintained that listing these Black-friendly businesses guaranteed a hassle-free vacation, plus it gave a tremendous boost to Black-owned businesses across the country. Publication stopped by 1966, and Alma passed away in 1978. McKinley Thompson Jr. was born and raised in New York City. He knew the road he wanted to travel in life because of one day in October of 1934. He was returning home from school in Queens when he spotted a silver gray Chrysler DeSoto Airflow, just like this 1934 model in our collections. It was pulling up to a traffic signal. He was about 12 and about a half a block away from the car. In an oral history interview he did in 2001, he said there were patchy clouds in the sky, and it just so happened that the clouds opened up for the sunshine to come through. It lit that car up like a searchlight. He began running towards it, but of course the light turned green and the car drove away before he could get a closer look. However, his curiosity was piqued, and he said, I was never so impressed with anything in all my life. I knew then that that's what I wanted to do in life. I wanted to be an automobile designer. That certainly was a challenge to the rules, because at that time there had not been a single African-American car stylist. He showed a lot of promise in drawing and was particularly interested in futuristic themes. He took commercial art courses throughout high school, and following graduation in 1940, completed drafting courses where he learned to plan projects and was able to present his ideas through his drawings and concept illustrations. With those skills, Thompson acquired his first job as a draftsman with the National Youth Administration. He then worked as an engineering design layout coordinator for the Army Signal Corps until he was drafted to serve in the Army Corps of Engineers during World War II. Following the war, he continued working for the Signal Corps until 1953, when he found an opportunity to pursue his dream and to become that automobile designer. In March of 1953, Motor Trend magazine sponsored this contest, an automotive and industrial design one, with the goal of discovering talented young adults. The prize? One of 5 4-year tuition-free scholarships to the prestigious Art Center School of Design in Los Angeles, one of the most respected schools for industrial design. The contest entry required several drawings and sketches, photographs or models of cars or whatever product you design, industrial product, along with an essay that responded to this prompt: what I think the trend in automotive design will be in the next 10 years. For McKinley Thompson, this risk was the chance of a lifetime, and he won. His winning entry appeared in the article From Dream to Drawing Board to ? In Motor Trend in September 1953. In his essay, Thompson wrote that cars of the future would sacrifice aerodynamics to accommodate more functional roominess and reduced size. His gas turbine car incorporated reinforced plastic, which was a risky choice of material at the time, yet he still won the top prize. He became the first African-American to attend the Art Center, and he excelled there. After graduation, he was offered a job with Ford Motor Company in the Advanced Styling Studio, finally realizing his dream and breaking a barrier by becoming the very first African-American automobile designer. Challenging the rules. In the Advanced Styling Studio, designers were given lots of creative freedom, which fit his interest in futuristic themes perfectly. It allowed him to contribute sketches for fantastical ideas like flying cars and a multi-trailered nuclear-powered truck. He worked in the design studio for the design of the Allegro and the Gyron, which is pictured here, which were concept cars for the 1961 Detroit Auto Show. And he collaborated on design ideas for the original production Mustang and Bronco. Well, his career at Ford gave him the opportunity to work on a variety of vehicles and concepts that would change the automotive industry. His most innovative idea had the potential to change the world. He recognized the important role mobility played in the growth of developing nations. Specifically, he believed an affordable, reliable vehicle would stimulate the economies of third world countries in Africa, much the same way the Model T revolutionized American transportation and contributed to the economy via Ford's $5 day wage. Thompson defined the need for an all-terrain vehicle able to cross rivers and small inland lakes for third world countries. It had to be easy to build and maintain with low production costs. But his vision extended beyond the vehicle, which he named the Warrior. He anticipated auto plants located in the developing countries that would use the car. It would bring them jobs, better roads, and eventually economic independence. Much like how the Model T brought America into the modern age and stimulated the economy through accessible and affordable mobility, Thompson thought the Warrior could do the same for third world nations. His program was called Project Vanguard. The plan was to use uniroyal plastic components. They were known as Royalex because they were lightweight, durable, and relatively cost efficient. The first phase of his plan involved building a facility where Royalex could be fabricated to use on the Warrior and then anything else they wanted to build. The second phase would involve building a vehicle division to build the Warrior and then future vehicles, then a marine division to construct boats, and finally a container division where they would build what he called habitat modules for housing. Ford Motor Company was supportive when he first brought the idea to them in 1965, but they ultimately passed on the project in 1967. They didn't think the vehicle would sell in large enough quantities to support the investment. Despite that setback, Thompson still believed that his vehicle could succeed. He thought that if he produced a prototype car, he could demonstrate the possibilities of this unique application of Royalex. He could attract interest and investment in the program with that. He gathered his friends who helped finance the Warrior prototype, including one friend, Wally Triplett, who was the first African-American from the draft to ever play in the National Football League. He played for the Detroit Lions. By day, Thompson drafted concept drawings for Ford, and at night he worked to bring the Warrior to life in a garage he rented on the west side of Detroit. Once the prototype was complete, Thompson and his partners attempted to market it to other investors and groups. They reached out to the Small Business Administration, which turned them down because the business would be outside the United States. They tried the Agency for International Development, and they simply weren't interested. A group of investors at Chrysler assisted small businesses in getting started and suggested that he establish a market first for Royalex in the United States. But plastic body vehicles were still an unusual concept, and automakers were still only experimenting on a limited scale. So basically, he was caught in a classic catch-22. He needed a Royalex facility to establish a market for plastic-bodied vehicles, but he couldn't get the facility built without an existing market for plastic-bodied vehicles. Instability on the African continent derailed any opportunity to conduct business with them directly. And he even tried to secure a bank loan and would build the car in Detroit, but he was ultimately denied. When every potential investor he approached told him it was a good idea, it was encouraging, but he simply wasn't able to secure the funding he needed to pursue it, and finally had to shut the project down in 1979. But around the same time that doors closed on the Warrior, he developed another way to influence and change people's lives. He coordinated a traveling exhibit that featured the work of other African-American automobile designers, trying to motivate and encourage young people to look for design careers. Thompson traveled across the country, staging his exhibit in schools and shopping centers. He had an impressive 28-year career with Ford. In 1962, he was awarded Ford's highest honor for community service, their Citizen of the Year Award. He contributed to a variety of projects, including experimental concept cars, worked in the Thunderbird and Falcon design studios, and eventually oversaw 50 craftspeople and modelers before retiring in 1984. Despite his career success, he continued to regret that his Warrior vehicle and the overall program never materialized. He was proud of the accomplishment of building it and proving that it was basically feasible, but it was simply a project that was ahead of its time in design and philosophy. The extensive use of plastic that is so common today was revolutionary at the time. His larger economic prophecy, though, was partially fulfilled in 1995, when Ewart Smith's URI, an all-terrain vehicle designed for African terrain, was manufactured in the small town of Whitly, Namibia. URI plant became Whitly's largest employer and provides economic stability to the area. And even though the Warrior never made it to market, Thompson kept the car, as you can see here. They used it as a leisure vehicle, taking it on family vacations, and occasionally used it to run errands, which caused a lot of attraction to be drawn to him. In 2001, he donated his prototype to the Henry Ford and passed away, unfortunately, in 2006 at the age of 83 after battling Parkinson's disease. I'd like to finish up with a couple of our most well-known and well-documented African-American inventors and innovators. George Washington Carver was born into slavery, yet overcame the color barrier to become a world-renowned scientist and educator. He left home around age 10 to get an education at a nearby town that had a one-room schoolhouse for African-American children. He lived with a family there, and he helped around the house in exchange for room and board. That was a pattern he'd followed for 20 years as he pursued his education. He completed his formal studies at the Agricultural College of Iowa, the first African-American to receive his bachelor's degree in 1894 and master's degree in 1896 there. He was offered employment at the college as a botanist and assistant lecturer, but Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee Institute, requested he come to Alabama and chair that college's agricultural department. He accepted that challenge. He left behind a well-equipped Iowa campus and showed up at the ravaged fields of Tuskegee, which was a former cotton plantation that had suffered from years and years and years of single crop farming. His first job, once he got to Tuskegee, was to define the issues with the soil. Still, most farmers at the time were planting the same crop year after year, and their crops were failing as a result. Carver showed them how implementing rotations of nitrogen-fixing legumes, such as peas and beans, with other crops could revitalize their depleted soil. He founded the Farm Institute at Tuskegee, where one night each month, farmers would gather to hear him talk about farming techniques and economics. He began to make speaking tours to promote better farming practices and new crops such as peanuts, soybeans, sweet potatoes, and grains, optimizing. Carver worked to build demand for these new crops by developing and sharing new recipes and teaching food preservation techniques like canning and drying. But he may best be remembered for developing imaginative uses for these crops. He discovered over 100 uses for sweet potatoes, including laundry starch, candy, dye, and flour. He developed over 300 products from peanuts, including rubber, paper, ink, lubricants, fertilizer, bleach, 30 different dyes, wood stains, face cream, cough syrup, a milk substitute, and flour. He received 3 patents for processes using the peanut in making cosmetics and pigments. He compiled hundreds of recipes for the peanut, even using his peanut milk to make cheese and ice cream. The ice cream sounds good to me, but not peanut cheese. He even found ways to use parts of the plant that were normally discarded, such as making briquettes from peanut shells. He crusaded through the South, promoting the peanut and its products to farmers, manufacturers, and consumers. He spent 40 years at Tuskegee, declining high-paying offers from prestigious institutions and even an offer to work with Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. He received numerous awards and honorary degrees throughout his life, and at least 18 schools were named after him. By 1940, peanuts were the South's second largest cash crop, and more farmers were following good rotation practices and finally reaping abundant harvests. Carver passed away in 1943. Now, this face may be familiar, but it's inside this bus that on December the 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks sat in the first row behind the whites only section in an area that could be occupied by either whites or blacks. All the seats in the bus were filled, so when another white man entered the bus, the driver, following standard practice of the day, demanded that all 4 blacks in the first row give up their seats. Mrs. Parks was an active member of the local NAACP, and that day she just quietly refused to give up her seat. Her action was spontaneous. She said later, "When I made that decision, I knew that I had the strength of my ancestors with me." She was neither the first African American nor the first woman to challenge the segregation laws of a public transportation system, but her character, her strength, her moral fortitude caused her act to ignite action in others. She knew the risk of public humiliation, arrest, and possible threats to her family and home. And indeed, they got those threats, and she and her husband moved to Detroit in 1957 because of those threats. From a scrapbook kept by a business line employee, we have hundreds of original newspaper clippings detailing her arrest and conviction for violating the segregation laws, along with the responses of the bus company and other groups. Mrs. Parks appealed her conviction, which formally challenged the legality of segregation. And at the same time, local civil rights activists initiated a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. A group named the Montgomery Improvement Association, composed of local activists and ministers, organized the boycott. As their leader, they chose a young Baptist minister who was new to Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. Since African Americans made up about 75% of the riders in Montgomery, the boycott posed a serious economic threat to the company and a threat to the social threat to the white rule of the city. The boycott lasted 381 days into December of 1956, when the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation law was unconstitutional and the Montgomery buses were integrated. Its impact, however, was immense. It demonstrated that a self-disciplined, organized, and steadfast movement could see success. It drew international attention to the inequalities in American society, and it brought Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence. The bus boycott was the beginning. It sparked numerous other protests against Jim Crow laws and signaled the beginning of the civil rights movement. And of course, it inspires other groups to this day. For her actions, Rosa Parks has been called the mother of the civil rights movement, and she visited Greenfield Village in 1992 with a group of students during a freedom tour sponsored by the Raymond and Rosa Parks Foundation. She posed here in the Maddox House, which is our 1930s Georgia home of an African-American family, after she spoke to the students. She was just an ordinary person, and she knew the risks of her actions. But through her example, she showed others what was possible. When she passed away in 2005, she was accorded the honor of lying in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Thank you for letting us share a little bit of the Henry Ford. Do we have any questions? Hopefully that we could answer.
Thank you so much, Janice. And I don't see anything in the chat right now, but please feel free to stick any questions or comments in the chat about anything you've seen here tonight. We have a couple of other things to share with you. So if you're thinking about a question, I'll just vamp for a little bit, see if you have time to put that in the chat. But thank you so much, Janice. Virtual claps for you. And Phil, if you wouldn't mind keeping the presentation up and then just keeping it at the Model I portion, that would be great. Thank you. So as we went through those stories, if you were to hold up these actions and habits against those stories, Janice even used some of that language as she was talking through them. But you can see how this framework really does apply across those stories. So we can talk about optimization from looking at Elijah McCoy and how he optimized his patent for a lubricator for locomotives, or McKinley Thompson as he tried to optimize his Warrior car. But in all of these, you could really make an argument that any of these actions and any of these habits can be attached to these stories. But the key here is kind of picking out the strongest ones and looking at really exactly how those innovators used and practiced those actions and habits. And I say practiced because we believe that anyone can be an innovator. And we encourage teachers and students to look at this framework and use it as a tool to, like I said in the beginning, not only assess historical stories, but also take a look inward and start practicing and using these. And I bet that if we did a quick assessment right now, you're already using these actions and habits. But if you can think about which ones you want to work on and which ones you want to continue doing, that can sometimes make the difference. I see we have a question here. Oh, not a question, but just a comment. Thank you, Valencia. Feel free to put more questions in the chat or in the Q&A. That's great. One other thing I wanted to share tonight. So if you're looking at these stories, if you've looked at the collections that we've shared with you tonight, and you're interested in learning more or getting more information or more resources, we have a few places that you can do that. So one of them is the biggest place probably is our inHub website. So we've compiled all of our lesson plans, some of which use this Model I language and pull on some of the stories you heard tonight. We have compiled all of those lesson plans and resources in something we called inHub, which I will put the link for that in the chat right now. So if you go to that website, you can, Phil's going to pull it up right now so you can see it. Thanks, Phil. You can go to that website and sign up for a free basic account and get access to about 140 lesson plans that are ready to go. You can implement them in your classroom as is, but they're also designed to be flexible. So you can pick the ones you want to use, which ones are most relevant for your classroom, that maybe hit on the topics you're teaching at the time. You'll also find that we have links out to some of our what we call digital assets. So if you go to the Henry Ford's website, you'll find you can search our digital collections. I will say not all 26 million artifacts are digitized. We've got about 112,000 digitized, but you can search through those And a lot of those collections are things that you will not find on display because their paper or photographs are really fragile and can't be on display. So as Phil's putting in the chat, in the search box now, you can search for something like the Warrior, which we just heard about. Take a look at the pictures. You can download those pictures to use in your classroom. This one has a really cool panorama. So we've actually have actually been able to take 360-degree pictures in this particular car, so you can see what it looks like, which is pretty neat. And then if you scroll down on any of our articles or artifact cards, rather, you can find related content. So on the right-hand side there, you can see a couple blog posts. Sometimes there are expert sets, which are groupings of artifacts combined that have been pulled together by our curators around a particular theme or subject area. So those can be great resources for you if you have a specific topic in mind that you're trying to teach and trying to find primary sources for. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will send all of these things to you, or some of these things to you in a resource guide that we'll send after this webinar. I'm going to try to put it in the chat right now, so you can grab it right now if you want to, possibly.
The other thing, Olivia, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Yeah, go for it.
The other thing I wanted to mention, the presentation that we showed you, the majority of those images and things that we put in there are from our collections, but there were a couple things that weren't. And so if you're an educator who is teaching maybe the history of technology or innovation, invention, what have you, one resource that we really like to point out that we used in this presentation was, if you're not familiar with it, there is Google patent search. And so some of those patent drawings that we shared with you, not all of them are in our collection. Some of them were actually taken from Google Patent. You can actually go and search up inventors, engineers, anyone who holds a patent, and you can find some of their drawings and sort of read the explanations for what is this thing. So if you're looking to put some really interesting primary source documents into your instruction, into your classroom for your students to take a look at, whether it's just to look at the imagery and the drawings or to actually read into the text, that's a really cool thing to check out and sort of see the evolution of technology. And you can also come to our website and find some other things, because sometimes people submitted patent models along with patent drawings. So for example, we have all of Thomas Edison's patent models in our collection that he submitted for his patents. So those are really interesting to compare and contrast and look at. So yeah, thanks. Just wanted to mention that.
No, that's great, Phil. Thank you. And I did put the link to Google Patents in the chat as well, if you're interested in that. So if there aren't any other questions, I think that's just about all the information we had for you tonight. But please feel free to get in touch with us. I will throw my email in the chat if you're interested. If you have questions about anything that you see, if you explore inHub or you're exploring our website, please feel free to get in touch. We also do offer professional development workshops and webinars like this one where we could customize something for your group of teachers. So please feel free to get in touch with us about that, and we'd love to hear from you. So I just want to say a big thank you to Janice for being our resident expert in pretty much everything Henry Ford. Thank you to Phil for being behind the scenes and for putting that presentation together. Thank you to the National Council for History Education for having us tonight. We're really thrilled and excited to be here. And thanks to all of you for listening, whether you're listening live or you're watching later. We want to be a resource for you. So like I said, please reach out, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.